followership, right? Everybody wants to raise their hand and call themselves a leader and say they're a leader, but if everyone's leading in so many different directions, who's following, right? And I think from that perspective, one of the biggest things that I implement in our programs and in my teams, or I try to, is it's a structured order from freshmen to seniors, right? And what that is, it's called, I took this from the Air Force Academy and I apply it to our program. And it's called the PITO leadership model, the PITO. So, and what that is it's a integrated system over the course of 4 years where we develop our players from their freshman year through their senior year. And at that core, again, are of course, the core values and always keeping the focus on leadership and character.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Reflective Coach podcast with Coach Luca. I'm delighted to bring you this episode, and it is so close to the last episode that was released, just one day in between. So how lucky are you lot, the listeners, the guests, those who are out there chipping into the podcast? You get 2 episodes in the space of 24 hours. I bring you very exciting news, and hence the release of this one. Hector Cano, who is the guest on this one, lands a brand new job, and it's a huge congratulations to him. This episode coincides with his press release upon his new position and what he's going to take on where he is now. Best of luck, Hector, and I hope this episode fits in very nicely with what you're going to bring and display in a new job. Hector talks about his experiences and how he's going to mould that into his new position and his outlook towards what he's going to want to do and how he's going to approach things within his new position. It's going to be great to see Hector's journey now within his new job and what he is able to bring to that job, and when we meet again and connect in the future, we can really have that reflective process, which is really exciting. I know Hector's very much looking forward to this post, and he is going to be an absolute asset. What you get to hear and what you get to listen to within this episode about Hector, his experience, his methodology, his framework, will really shape upon what he's going to do, as well as being able to evidence the fact what he will be delivering on a day-to-day. So when he gets fully settled into that position, his job, you'll be able to see what he is actually doing from what you've heard and seen on this episode to what he does then on the day-to-day and is able to share across his socials. I was delighted to invite Hector onto the podcast, as Hector has a wealth of experience and a wealth of personal and professional knowledge which he brings into play. He talks about his experiences in terms of his upbringing and how his outlook and disciplines have been shaped. He is an ex-army veteran turned into teacher/coach, and he is able to apply that within his methodology and framework. It is great because we were able to have that reflective experience from where he's had other jobs outside of football, outside of soccer, outside of coaching, that has allowed him to really shape the way that he approaches things both in his personal and professional life. It's great because Hector's had such a great experience and delivers so much on a day-to-day. It was really exciting to have him on. He also is founder and co-host of the 50/50 pod, and it is such a delight to have someone from a much bigger podcast come on to mine. He is an interviewee himself. He is a podcaster, so to be on the other side and be the interviewee was really exciting, as well as created a little bit of pressure for me. But it's one that I was really excited for because I've seen so much of Hector's work, both in terms of what he does in coaching as well as what he does on the pod. His pod is one to aspire to and is such an exciting pod. It is the 50/50 pod. You can find it on my Twitter. And you can see reshares which I'll be sharing out over the next few days to really support this episode. But that is a fantastic podcast, and it's great to have Hector on, and I'm so delighted with all the support that he's given and everything that I've received from him. So it's a big thank you from me, Hector. I really do appreciate it. Whilst we now look at the episode and what's in it, we talk about teaching and how that may look, understanding methodology and what this really is, understanding your level both as a player and as a coach, and really understanding how to turn off that ego, really understanding where you can improve on your skill set, really understanding maybe what level works for you, and maybe not to have aspirations that are too high, or if you do have those aspirations, to go out and follow them, but then to really understand where you might enjoy life most at that point. The grass isn't always greener, and although a job opportunity might come up, it might be more money, you might have more resources, you might have more opportunity in terms of what you can deliver in terms of that success. You know, you might not enjoy it as much as that you would have from somewhere that might be paying you slightly less and have less resources. So it's about knowing your level and knowing where you're at in life. Hector really talks about PO leadership, something that he took away from the army, and something that's very interesting. So really listen out for that within the episode. Continuing your journal and continue to take notes away from that. I love this quote from Hector. You'll never always be motivated, so you must be learned to be disciplined. Again, it fits in with his upbringing, his army experiences, what he does on a day-to-day basis, and that is such a fantastic quote which I really love. Hector then spoke about team challenges, controlling the controllables, empowering your own decisions and then empowering others. Do it until you can't get it wrong. So that repetition, that consistency, that application, that discipline, that process, really knowing your level, whereby if you know you're at that level, how can you improve to get to next levels, and knowing what you need to do to get there. The game is the natural teacher, so you can plan a number of training sessions. You can look to be as technical as possible, but with games, repetition and that outlook and motivation, as well as knowing the game is there for fun, that's what it's all about. Hector then mentions brain dumps, so again another key information and takeaway to really look into and listen out for to continue notes. We then talked about situational and objective positions, and there was so much within this. So overall we talked about philosophy, methodology, the full circle, reflection, values, team challenges, controlling the controllables, the discipline, the here and now, important moments, empowerment, and game management. This is such an amazing episode. Whilst I was recording this with Hector, it was great to have on, as I said, a podcaster, but as we got talking, I thought he's going to take the accolade for the longest recorded episode. Only until after the episode finished I was able to check the timings on the longest, and we just finished short off. But I think this takes second place, but this is not about quantity, it's about quality. But you're so lucky because this episode bridges in both, and so does the one in first place. There is so much within this episode, and it's a very exciting one to have released on schedule. I really hope you listen to this and take as much away from that I did. It's been great to really connect with Hector and see the great work that he does every day. He is such a fantastic individual, such a fantastic professional, and we were able to talk about real life experiences as well. So he has a daughter who's taken up soccer and has that interest, and we talked about how that might play out from being a professional delivering sports, soccer, coaching day to day, and whether he would take on a team or how that may look, how they may shape that relationship, how he may be framed or seen in that position, and how that may affect that parent-child relationship. It was an experience which I've been able to reflect upon because my dad was my coach for my football team, and it wasn't the most successful of periods, and that's because I had a big contribution as a child that I didn't really understand that, and therefore I expected to have more from him, and tried to get more leniency off him when he come down harder on me when he needed to. It's only until years later I have that regret, which I wish I behaved in different ways, but I wish he had done that for longer. But I'm able to take that away within my philosophy, and I've been able to help prevent some of the kickbacks from other children that have been in my team, and the fact that their parents have come on board as coaches as well. As I understand that relationship, and I don't want that to be hampered. I want them to experience the years of coaching their child and vice versa with mother, father, etc., whereby they're involved in the club, the team, and maybe in coaching. So it was great to have that real life experience, that connection, that reflection. But it's such a wonderful episode. As I said, Hector has so much to offer. Really check out his socials, check out his podcast. It's a fantastic podcast and one really worth listening to. Again, keep on with your journal, but you can find the podcast on Spotify, Podcast Addict, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Pinterest, and TikTok. If you just follow the link tree link, it'll give you all the connections and links to the socials. You can find it TRC Podcast _ on Twitter. I'm Anthony _ Luca 96. You can find it, the Reflective Coach Podcast, everywhere else. We are sponsored by Humble Gifts Company. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, and Etsy, as well as LinkedIn. I am delighted to bring you this wonderful episode, and a huge congratulations again, Hector. Drop that like, drop that follow, drop that subscribe, leave a comment. It really helps build the profile of the podcast, and I hope to expand this as much as possible. And I'm able to expand it with such fantastic guests such as Hector and everyone else that I've had on so far, as well as everyone else who's appearing in the future. It's a big thank you from me. This is Coach Luca on the Reflective Coach Podcast. Okay. Well, Hector, it's great to have you on. I know we've been chatting in the week and we've had to rearrange this, but it is great to have someone of your caliber on, someone who's a podcast themselves, a head coach, coach, director of football. And what I actually found out is someone who had an Olympic boxing dream, someone who played semi-pro in Europe, and is a US Air Forces veteran, if I'm correct in saying so. That absolute history of who you are, Hector, is just made you even more wonderful than you already were over chat. So it is great to have you on.
Thank you, Luca. Appreciate it. Excited to be here on the Reflective Coach podcast with you, and have quickly become a big fan of what you're doing. So keep up the great work. But yeah, man, you covered my whole life story. There isn't really much of. I guess this concludes the podcast, right? There's not much left to say.
That's it. Yeah, it was the smallest podcast episode in history. I think we might have broke a record.
There we go.
But yeah, no, it is great to have you on. And obviously, as you said, you're in this transition period now, which is, at the end of the season, and you're gearing up towards a new season ahead and what that looks like for you. But how's your season gone so far this year in terms of this back end and where you're at now?
So as you mentioned, excuse me, as you mentioned, in the middle of transition, having left my previous position, my most recent position at St. Mary's Hall, which is a college prep school here in San Antonio, Texas, and I was there for it was an interesting story because I was there for 5 years previously, from 2014 to 2019. Then left to a different part of the state for 2 years. I was coaching in El Paso on the public school side of the house, if you will, and then came back in 2021 and was there for 2 years. Came across a lot of new people, a lot of great people, but also good people that were there previously, and it was great. It was a great time there, and I had the privilege and the honor of being able to also have my daughter attend school there and play for me as well. So that was a pretty awesome opportunity. But because for a number of reasons, primarily family reasons, logistical reasons, I decided to step down from my post as director of soccer and the varsity women's soccer coach there at St. Mary's Hall, and I'm in the middle of, like I said, transitioning into a new role, new position, and returning back to the public school side of things.
Definitely interesting, and it's a great background there in terms of what you've had in that experience, and very exciting towards where you're going. You mentioned there, obviously, coaching your own daughter. How was that for you in terms of that experience, going from coach to sort of parent coach, and that combination of emotion and relationship in that sense?
Yeah, it was pretty. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little nervous, only because I had coached her obviously on my own, doing skill work, ball work, and whatnot since she was little. I was one of her very first coaches back in the U5 days. Coached her for, I think, about 2 years, and then she had this interesting period where she stepped away from the game because she didn't want to play unless Dad was coaching her, right? So she ultimately returned to the game. I think when she was about, I want to say 9, 10 years old. Took a few years off and decided to play. Wanted to come back and play, and then she was doing great. She was playing in the youth club system here in the United States, here in Texas, and in Colorado. And then I think from her time, from when she previously saw me being a high school coach, as I mentioned, my first stint at St. Mary's Hall, she was exposed to the game. She was exposed to the school, and she saw the difference in the high school game versus the club game. And then, of course, when I had the opportunity to come back to St. Mary's Hall, and she was entering high school, it was an opportunity for her to, for me to be able to coach her. And like I said, I was a little nervous because it had been so long. And when you're at that level, you're a little nervous because I think as you'll probably know, the coach's kid, right, whenever they're on the team, they tend to get it a little harder, right? The expectations are a little higher, and because you want to show zero level of favoritism, right? And so it's very important. And when we do that, I think, as you and I would agree, oftentimes being the coach's kid, they tend to get it a little harder, right? Just, you need to coach them tougher, be a little bit more disciplined, strict with them if need be, showing no signs of preference, and just kind of taking that out of the equation as well, just because, you'll have your administration, your team, your parents, and your team. Most of all, your team needs to know that you're everyone's coach, equally, right? So, but as a a testament to her, to my daughter, more than more than me, she did great. She was able to flawlessly, and I truly mean flawlessly, understand the difference between when I'm dad and when I'm when I'm coach. And so I think credit to her. It was a blast. I had the honor and the privilege of being able to coach her for the first 2 years of her 4 years of high school, and I'm grateful for that. It was great.
It sounds like a great experience, and obviously it's tough being the coach's daughter in that sense, but it's great that you sort of had that approach across the board of what the expectations are, and she obviously understood. And, I've got sort of that flip side of the coin in that sense, because I was the coach's son when I was a little bit younger, and it didn't really work out for me in that sense. My dad stepped up to be the coach of the team, and it was a really awkward time because we were transitioning from primary to secondary, and one of the coach's dad had just left, and he was our best player, and he'd left, and a few of the other boys ended up leaving because the team ended up not being as successful as they were. And my dad was never had that coaching experience before, so he was new to it as well, and I couldn't comprehend how he was going to be coach. And I thought I was going to be Billy Big Bollocks when I was going to step up as a player, but I never had that technical ability. I was never that natural leader on the pitch as a younger kid, so it never ended up working out for me. So I ended up becoming a player that he ended up disciplining quite a lot, and I ended up reacting in quite a negative sense. And I look back with a great opportunity that my dad took over, but I look back and going, oh, I wish that was longer, or I wish I had reacted in different ways. But it was difficult for him because he never had that coaching experience, so he was learning on the job as well. But now I'm a coach.
How old were you?
Probably 11, 12, around that age.
Okay.
So still quite young in that sense, but it was difficult in that, looking back on it from a coaching perspective and who I am now. And I'm very lucky because I've worked with parents who have come on board as coaches, and I've supported, and I've been able to understand that sort of relationship with the child, and tried to make sure that doesn't happen in terms of their relationship. So I've been quite lucky in that sense, but I'm very lucky. Well, I'm not a parent yet, so I always think to myself, when I have a child, would I want to coach them? And I'm sure I'm going to stand on the sideline and go, yeah, that's going to happen at some point, because I'm going to be drawn into it. But I can't wait for that moment. So every time I see, it's that envious of the relationship and seeing that current parents and their kids. But I can't wait for when that does happen. But I know how I want to approach it in the right way and make sure I'm not overbearing, and making sure that they've got the time to enjoy it as well.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I said it's just, kudos to my daughter, because it speaks volumes of her in terms of just her character, the type of young leader she is, her personality, and how I think how resilient and how she was able to compartmentalize, because I think she also knew that she had enough experience having seen me coach by the time she was going into high school, that dad was not exactly a walk a walk in the park when it came to being a coach, right? So so I learned a lot, believe it or not, in that relationship. I really feel like I learned more from her than probably she did from me.
And that's a great experience which she'll have and she'll cherish, especially as she gets older. And, you can never repeat those moments. And I'm quite big on making sure every moment of a child's life, because they can't relive that, and we don't have time machines, and we can't go back and relive those moments. They are literally so important, because, I can't go back and be that 11, 12-year-old. And as we're coaching now 11, 12-year-olds, they can't go back and have those moments. So I'm massive on that. So I'm sure she'll cherish it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So how did you get into coaching? Was it something that you fell into, you chose to? Is passion a calling? How did you get into coaching?
Oof, yeah, that's man, that's probably like a 3-hour podcast in itself, right? But no, I think it was kind of interesting. I always kind of had the coaching bug, I guess. And and I've had this question asked in the past, and it's one that I feel that is still every time I tell the story, there's something new that I kind of remember, right? But I think for me, the kind of had the coaching bug for a long time. I was fighting it. I was resistant to it, and as you know, I was active duty military for the longest time, and while I was in Europe, and while I had the opportunity there to play, But of course, I was a little older, and then of course, I mean, still young, but older in terms of by soccer standards. But excuse me, but I was out with injury for a certain amount of time. I started jumping in and helping out the coaching staff, right? Because I'm the type that needs to be doing something. And so they kind of started putting me to work, right? Whether it was putting out cones, setting up, asking for feedback and input on activities, um, on training sessions, and getting to see the coaching staff a little bit closer, a little bit more in terms of the methodology behind a training session, right? Because when you're a player, you have no concept of the methodology that goes, into it, whether it's from a from a training warm up, the natural progression of a training session, right? So, but when I started to see that, and I started to see the methodology, the method to the madness, the science behind it, the theory behind it, I found it fascinating. And then I also saw how coaches interacted with each other and where they were coming from in terms of why they wanted to play certain players in certain positions, how they viewed certain players, and what everything they were trying to do to set them up for success. Where when you're on the other side of the aisle as a player, sometimes those things don't always make sense to you, even when a coach kind of tries to explain it to you. So all of that kind of helped really lure me in to want to consider it. And then, of course, I still had plenty of years that I still had to do while I was active duty, but I stayed involved with the game, became a student of the game first and foremost, and then, excuse me, and then started coaching club there while I was in Colorado when I was stationed, when I arrived at the Air Force Academy. And at the same time, one of my first big breaks was being able to work both first at the prep school and then at the Division I women's soccer program there at the Air Force Academy. And I was hooked. At that point, I was really hooked in terms of, I know this is on some level, in some capacity, this is what I want to do when I retire from the military.
And that's certainly, it's great that you've had that plan to sort of transition straight into that. And, those experiences have led to where you're currently at now because, as much as you have transitioned, the amount of horizons which you currently have between podcasting, coaching, director of football and where it has gone, it's just exploded in so many different routes and avenues. And because of that experience, so it's fantastic to hear how that has worked out in that sense, because as much as a kid, I know my parents were always like, oh, what do you want to do when you're older? And the natural response was professional footballer, but I never had any technical ability to even play like semi-pro or even play for like the local grassroots squad now in terms of the first team. So, but I always knew coaching was within me and that's something that I wanted to do. And they always spoke about that as I grew up. But as I got into secondary, obviously, the academia takes over and the expectations are you go to uni, you do this. And coaching isn't really spoken about in terms of what is an option for you when you're in a secondary school. And it's only by volunteering with a local authority, which we have here, whereby I actually fell into coaching and volunteering started, and it allowed me then to go, I love coaching. How can I get into a grassroots club? How can I get on my qualifications? And this has currently led to where I'm at in a similar sort of avenue to, this happened and look how it's exploded. I never expected at 16 to have a podcast. I never expected to coach at a professional club. I never expected to work full-time in football previously. So it's one of those whereby unless you have a real strategy where you're going to go into uni and do this, that, and then progress, it's something that I fell into, but I've really enjoyed having that opportunity to coach and currently be where I'm at now.
Yeah, and it is kind of interesting how sometimes I think the jobs kind of the careers kind of pick us, right? We kind of sometimes we fight it, but there's certain things that we start to, and maybe it comes through trial and error, and we have to go experience different things before we realize we kind of come back to something that's like, this is what I should be doing. And as you said, I think in your journey, right, as a coach, one of the things that, you say you may not be the most technically skilled of players, but history tells us across many sports, right, not just football, not just soccer, but history tells us that some of the greatest coaches in history have often been some, subpar athletes, subpar players themselves, but that was what propelled them to become such great students of the game and such great teachers of the game. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. And that sounds like you're doing great stuff too.
Well, thank you very much, and that's something that I try to allude to. I always argue, well, Jose Mourinho wasn't a great player, but look at where he's at now. So
Yeah, yeah,
that's what I use as my excuse in terms of coaching and where I'm at.
yeah. I never understood the mentality of let's pick the absolute best professionals. They naturally have to be able to be great coaches, and no, oftentimes they have the least amount of patience to be able, and they have the hardest time in terms of empathy, of understanding sometimes when another athlete may not be able to do what they could just kind of naturally do, right? So yeah, that I get that. I think, and this is a sport where it's very rare where you come across a coach that never played the game, right? So it's one thing to be limited in terms of your experience versus never having played it versus being a high level professional that has a very recognizable name.
Absolutely, and I love what you say there about empathy and maybe not being at that level or being at those levels and not progressing into a quality coach in that sense. And as you said that, literally in the back of my mind, I've got Roy Keane because as much, he played for United and he's always on about high standards, expectations. And when he said he was Ipswich manager, for example, he said he couldn't comprehend the fact that players couldn't do what he was doing or the players that he had around him when he was at United, and therefore he lacked that empathy, he lacked that understanding, and maybe therefore shot himself in the foot. And it's only until he's reflected back that he's understood that, but at that time in that moment it ended up being detrimental to him in that sense then.
Right. Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I think some people have to see it for it to, I guess, connect.
And it relates back to our trial and error in that sense, because until you're in that moment and you're doing it, then you can, unless you're a real thinker and sometimes you've got everything mapped out and planned out, then, it's about finding that experience and where you're at. But I love what you said earlier about that methodology, about understanding it when you started coaching yourself and being part of it, because that relates back to when I was 11 and 12. I didn't understand what my dad was doing or planning out the sessions. I didn't really understand it in that sense of how he was approaching it. And that's something that I take within me now as a coach, and I want my players to understand why I'm doing it, why the expectations of this, why maybe I'm going to move them from, say, left wing to left wing back. And sometimes I had a coach last season who's a parent of a kid, and he said, why are you playing my son left back when he's a left wing? I was like, you're a coach, you should be able to answer that question yourself. But it's about understanding that methodology, and that's something which I build upon in terms of my approach, and something which is really important as you've mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that process, that understanding, excuse me, that understanding is, and when you're a new coach, it doesn't matter what level, it doesn't matter what playing experience level you have. When you're a new coach, a developing coach, right? You're trying to develop a philosophy, a methodology. You're trying to understand. It's like, okay, what am I like as a coach? Because inevitably as a coach, you're going to get asked, what is your philosophy? What is your methodology? Or what is your thought on this? Or what is your thought on this? And I think it's very important in terms of, as a young coach, you're very much a blank canvas, right? So who you surround yourself with, who your mentors are, who you have regular exposure to. But then just as you said, right, also understanding that when you're a young up-and-coming coach, maybe you're a U11, U12, you're a grassroots level coach, you can read all the Pep Guardiola books. That doesn't mean go and instantaneously read it and then apply it to U11s, U12s, right? Everything because this is a professional coach. This is one of the best to ever do it. And so that's a different level. So I think it's very important with young coaches to understand that as well, to say, hey, how can, because as coaches, we're very much, I kid and I say that coaches are very much thieves, right? We collaborate and we steal from each other, right? In terms of what will work for us, what will work for our environment, our setting. And so, yeah, I think that understanding take the good, take the message, but understand how can you apply it at your level, right? And sometimes that's one of the hardest things when you're going up for badges, when you're going up for coaching badges and you're going through certification courses. That's oftentimes one of the hardest things to comply with, because when you're going through the course, they want you to do it their particular method, right? A very much template, and younger coaches will struggle with that because they will exclusively see it from, well, I wouldn't do it like that because in my particular setting for my club, my school, my program, I can't do this or I can do this. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Mm. Absolutely, and it can be difficult then in that sense in terms of what you say. Try to understand it at that level and try to apply it at that level, and being on that coaching course where the competencies are, oh, this is the way we do it. This is the expectation. You all have to coach a similar way to hit these points to become the coaching on that outcome. And I was like, well, just imagine if Jose Mourinho and Pep Guardiola and Mikel Arteta and Alex Ferguson all ended up being the same robotic coaches at the end of this process. We would never have seen the philosophies or the playing styles or the way they do things if everyone followed the same coach. I understand, there's competencies to be met and learning outcomes, etc. But we're not all coaches in the exact same way. And just because I haven't coached this session in terms of the expectations, it doesn't mean that you're going to fail as a coach when you're out there in that sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
So, as you're talking now, we've mentioned the word philosophy, and I know a lot of people, I've heard, some of the ex-pros say, what is a philosophy? There's no such thing as a philosophy. And sometimes in the back of my mind, I'm always like, oh, should I ask that question? Should I not ask that question? But I'm firmly a big believer of that you do have a philosophy. You have a way of doing things. You end up having that approach, the way you expect your teams. And that is a philosophy in that sense. So do you have a philosophy, or is that something you don't believe in?
No, I do. I think it's just a matter of, because I absolutely get where you're coming from. And I think, excuse me, I think it's just a matter of by association, trying to touch understanding when you ask that question with a coach. The way I attribute it is when you hear the word philosophy, coaching philosophy, is what does that mean to you, right? What it goes in one ear. How do you interpret that? And when you speak to it, what does that mean to you? And so for me, so much of it involves, even before you start getting into the X's and O's and the tactics and strategy, it's first and foremost, when I hear philosophy, it is, at its core, what are you about, right? What is the centerpiece to what you're about as a coach? Because I think you and I would agree that so much of what we do and what we talk about with our teams it's beyond just football. It's beyond soccer, right? It's beyond X's and O's, and to keep the locker room, if you will, to keep everybody on the bus heading in the same direction. So much of it for me, when I hear philosophy, has to be rooted in culture, right? That's also a buzzword, right? What does that mean? That can mean tons of different things to tons of different people. But from my standpoint, I don't use it as coach speak. When I say culture, is that for me, I'm a firm believer that it's at its core is we're built, my programs, I try to have them be built on core values and and also be character and leadership based. Everything, no matter the experience level, but it has to be player centered, right? Not coach centered. And what I mean by that is I'm not every year before I can figure out what we can do, what we can play, what I want to play in terms of system of play. I have to understand what I have, right? I have to understand what I have. So, and then it's being able to set up every single player for success as best as possible on game day by what we do in training sessions. And that means handling their development even within the team. And while we're trying to develop a team as a whole in training sessions, we're also still trying to develop players individually, right? Because their development levels, their tactical understanding, the soccer IQ, it can be a broad range. So how are we handling all of those in terms of that slanted slope from our most experienced, our more advanced, to our less experienced, less advanced, and they're all on the same team? Because even at the professional level, that exists, right? That exists. Excuse me. And then, and then the other piece at its core is, particularly at my level, being a high school coach, is understanding my role and trying to keep the focus on being a transformational coach, not a transactional coach, right? So, so using the opportunities to always talk about the core values that we implement, and oftentimes one of the ones that I like to mention is not it's not leadership, but followership, right? Everybody wants to raise their hand and call themselves a leader and say they're a leader, but if everyone's leading in so many different directions, who's following, right? And I think from that perspective, one of the biggest things that I implement in our programs and in my teams, or I try to, is it's a structured order from freshmen to seniors, right? And what that is, it's called. I took this from the Air Force Academy and I apply it to our program, and it's called the PITO leadership model, the PITO. So, and what that is it's a integrated system over the course of 4 years where we develop our players from their freshman year through their senior year. And at that core, again, are of course, the core values and always keeping the focus on leadership and character.
I love that, the Pito leadership, and I love how you've applied that in terms of working with those players and how you take them through those stages and how it looks. And followership and leadership. I love that you've touched upon that because again relating to those buzzwords. But I've been in an organisation now for 8 months, and the number of leadership opportunities which are presented for staff is fantastic. But I've come from a very traditional organisation into into an organisation that would like to think it's a forward-thinking organisation. And in terms of that sense, there are too many leaders, and what may have been a very simple process in my previous organisation going boom, 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 this is the decision, this is the outcome, this is how we're going to approach it. Suddenly it's like pinballing between 5 or 6 different people, then to fall in like a little hole to go, right, this is what we're doing. And then the ball will ping back up the next morning because someone else has said, we're doing this a little bit different. So we've got too many leaders and not enough followers in that sense. And it can be quite a difficult process to work within when you have too many leaders and you've got too many people making that decision, because it can be difficult to have that voice, that follower, that expectation where this is where we're going, this is the vision, this is the route, for example.
Yeah, it starts to it starts to almost sound like the bureaucracy of government itself, doesn't it? Yeah, and it can be, sometimes you can it can take you a while before you realize how much in the mix you are of all of that red tape sometimes. I think leadership, they're buzzwords, of course, leadership, but imagine you're the young coach, you're the brand new coach at the grassroots level, and you're gonna be asked to lead a team, right? To be the coach of a team. But who are you following in that process, right? In terms of your development for the greater good of their development, right? So, because they're in those critical years, right? We keep coming back to U11 and U12 because I know that's the story you mentioned, but imagine they're even younger than that, right? And and if it's a coach that is transactional based versus transformational, and they're a young coach, right? And they know no different. They just know that, hey, this is how we do it. This is how it should be done. When it's a transactional based coach versus a transformational coach, that's a real quick way where we stop having our athletes, they stop playing the game. They walk away from the game, right? Because it wasn't fun, it wasn't a great experience, and that's where we lose. That's where the game loses.
Of course, and I absolutely agree with you. And it's great that you talk about transformation, because we're currently in a lot of transformation process in terms of how we look at players, how we communicate with them, how we work with them, what the expectations are, and how the game is evolving. So, I think as it's the same for coaches in that sense, in terms of how we approach and where we're going in terms of that. But so we've touched upon your philosophy and what it is, and you mentioned earlier your values. So, what are your values, and how do you bring them into what you're doing in your approach?
Yeah. So, we talked about leadership, we talked about followership, and it's a handful of them. We talk character's there at the forefront, right? It doesn't matter. But we talked about character, respect, grit, right? Resiliency, grit. That's that's a big one. And accountability. Those are at the core of, they're oftentimes buzzwords, but why I hit on them so much in terms of why I mention it is because my programs, the team that I'm involved with, it's not just going to be coach speak. They're going to hear those words every day. They're going to hear those words every day, and they're going to be asked to live by them, right? And I think when you can get an entire squad all buying into that and buying into having faith in their coaches and what we're trying to do in terms of their development, in terms of the actual tactical development, or the technical development, the tactical development, the understanding, and where we're coming from. I think when all of that happens and you get 100% buy-in, that's when the special things start to happen, right? And because the ultimate goal really is not for them to be led by me, right? Not to be led by coach, but to be player led, right? Because that's where That's the difference between your special teams and your really good teams. The good teams they're going to be coach led, but the special teams, they're the accountability piece, right, to each other.
Mm-hmm.
They're player led. So I think that I've seen that way too many times, and I can tell you that there's at its core, the very special teams that come across that we get to see in this game, they're usually player led, and it's because they had exceptional team captains, they had exceptional team leaders, right? And then the coach can make the difference. Maybe can be the separator sometimes, but they're usually player led.
Of course, and one big example of that for me is Chelsea, because even though they've brought so much quality into their team, who are the real leaders? Because you think back over the years, they've had Ivanovic, they had Drogba, they had Makelele, they had Lampard, they had Terry, Ashley Cole, and they had all these leaders on the pitch. But who if you were to say, right, I'm going to pinpoint the leaders now, you'd be like, maybe so and so, maybe so and so, and then maybe that's why they're struggling, because they have too much technical quality and not a balance of leaders or that experience on the pitch, and that's why maybe they have shot themselves in the foot in that sense.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Was it six? What was the year? Was it 15, 16? When they won Champions League, right? And they had was it Di Martino? I think was their coach at the time.
I think that was a few years before. I think that was 11 or 12 or 13.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, but
yeah,
I mean, look at, and he was in there in almost basically in an interim role, very limited, right? But yet the people that they had, right, the players that they had on that team, right, Drogba and taking out Bayern. Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example. Granted, I'm not a big endorser of Chelsea, but that's another conversation.
Oh yeah, so if we were to say who do you endorse, would you mutter it under your breath?
I'm a Liverpool guy. I have been for a long time.
And that's another great team who has had those leaders over the years. Steven Gerrard, Jamie Carragher, and obviously now Jordan Henderson, James Milner, and these teams have started to be built on terms of those characters. And what Jurgen Klopp, when he went back into transition Liverpool, he ended up bringing those leaders back in because they were struggling under Dalglish to have that real leader, or under Roy Hodgson, and therefore by just going, right, I'm going to get an experienced player at 34, 35, and sometimes people from the outside, why are we signing a 35-year-old? And that's really the exact reason Man City have Scott Carson.
Locker room guy.
Yeah.
We call them locker room guys. Yeah.
Yeah, and you need those type of people to lead it through and to get where you're at. So when you got your philosophy, you got your values. Do your non-negotiables alter those values in any sense?
Do their values? I think it's understanding. When you say non-negotiables, I think that it's a matter of knowing what you have in your players. I think those become, generally speaking, they become irrelevant if you connect on a deeper level with your players and with your community, but especially with your players, right? Is you got to know their stories. You got to know more. There's got to be so many more conversations beyond just X's and O's, beyond just soccer, right? Understanding their background story, because that's the thing. Every one of us have a story, right? So what is their experience? What have they gone through just to get here, right? But I think when you have those conversations, when you have those conversations, you start to see more of that inner personality. You start to see more of their true makeup, right? And when you can do that, I think you're going to have a better opportunity to put them on the pitch and set them up for success. Whether that be coming off the bench, whether that be a starter, whether that be maybe they're maybe going to be a ball winner willing to, kind of grind and win a lot of those 50-50s in the midfield versus maybe a finisher or a winger. So yeah, I think I often find that doesn't really tend to present much of an issue, I guess, with me. I've been blessed in that perspective. So I haven't really had to find my way, and nor would I really be willing to compromise those as core values, right? And part of our mission and our vision, in terms of what we're about and where we're trying to go. I don't think those really should be up for negotiation. But that said, as a coach, if I haven't done my homework in terms of trying to connect on a deeper level with my players, understanding their backgrounds, understanding their family backgrounds, their family issues, what do they go home to? And of course that doesn't mean you're poking and you're prodding and you're prying. It's more of and that takes time, right? That takes time. But yeah, I think luckily I've been blessed in that part where I don't feel like I've had to really, I guess, have to bend. Because I'm not a rules guy. I'm a standards guy. Because I think problem with rules is, when you're in the classroom, oftentimes that list of rules can just keep getting longer and longer and longer and longer, right? And it's just, and that inevitably becomes too much. It becomes too much for any for any student to remember, right? Student athlete to remember. Part of the team on the field, it's the same philosophy in terms of the classroom is just different, right? It's now the field, right? This is my classroom. This is our classroom. So, and really what it becomes in terms of standards and the expectation is for you need to be meeting the standard or exceeding the standard, because it's one of three. You're either exceeding it, you're meeting it, or you're below it. So, and I feel, and that's in everything we do every day, right? Everything that our name is associated with as a student athlete, whether it's your grades in the classroom, out on the field, whatever we're doing in the weight room, training, whatever you're doing in the community. And then the big piece why we stress leadership so much is, are you being a leader off campus in the community, and especially within your family, right? In whatever capacity you can be a leader, but being a leader within your family, I think, helping promote community.
Absolutely, and I love that community sense in terms of what you build as well. And I love what you say there about rules, because again, I work in a secondary school, so where I transitioned from one secondary to another over the last few months. As you say, those list of rules, where I've gone into a new secondary, they've ended up growing as the years gone on in terms of how this looks, and there is so much going on. I can't get my head around it. I'm like, if I can't get my head around it, how can the students get their head around it?
Right.
And it completely relates there to where in my previous school, as soon as you walk in, you are representing that school. You have that proudness. You have that buy-in. The kids are like, yeah, I go to this school. And sometimes the kids can talk with arrogance because they went to such a high-standard organisation, rich in history. And it's not like, oh, I get to be arrogant because of this. It's that arrogance because of what the name brings. And I think it's that environment and that buy-in from the kids. Whereas where I've gone to this new organisation, the list of rules have expanded, but the kids aren't proud to represent that school. And they're not there yet. So it's great for me because it's about that change management and seeing one organisation of the high standards to one that is evolving and changing, and that will hopefully reach the one that I've come from, and hopefully those students have that buy-in. And it's the same with the team we're in. And if those players and those athletes have buy-in to who we are and naturally understand the expectations and they're proud to be there, you don't have to go in, these are my rules, these are my expectations, this is how this is going to look, and you don't have to discipline them as much because they're naturally going to understand it, and they're going to flourish because of that community essence which has been created.
Yeah, one of the ways I guess I view it, I don't know if this will make much sense, but as a parent, you realize that you have to put so much in terms of early childhood development and teaching right from wrong and values. I think it's no different with a team, right? It's the same thing, I guess, for those that maybe that don't have children. Maybe the next closest thing to kind of equate it to is, I guess, if you have a pet, a dog, maybe, where you have them as a young puppy, fresh puppy. The training piece, the right from wrong, the hey, this is what we do, this is what we don't do, investing in them up front, right? Same philosophy with a team is, but the ultimate goal is for them to be able to self organize, right? Self lead, self regulate, and keep them self accountable. I often have when it comes to training with teams, I have a quote that I really love, that I kind of live by, and it's that discipline piece, right? In terms of with teams, and telling them that you will never always be motivated, so you must learn to be disciplined, right? That self-discipline piece, so vital, so important. But the end goal really being that as a coach is I should be able to do very minimal in terms of, not training sessions really, but even within training sessions, but as the season progresses, and then if I'm with the group for more than 1 year, right, multiple years, I should be able to be less and less hands-on and more led by them, right? That self-accountable piece, the knowing the knowing that they're meeting the standard, and even then that maybe that's not okay. It's like, can we consistently exceed the standard? So yeah, I think that's the end. That becomes the end goal.
I love that, and I think it's a fantastic quote, and what you say is absolutely brilliant in terms of that sense. And when it comes down to obviously not setting those maybe the rules or the non-negotiables and then creating that buy-in, do you set then objectives for a season ahead of the season, or do you tend to let them roll out and go, all right, this is the success that we've had over the year, or X amount of players have done this and we've achieved this as a team, or is it success setting or looking back on success?
Yeah, I think the goals, the first of all is sitting down with the team, sitting down with individually with players, getting to understand their makeup, getting to understand, it's like, hey, what are maybe some personal goals? What are some interests? Why are you here? Why are you playing? Finding out, digging into the why. But then when we put them together as a team and ask them, it's like, hey, how are we going to define success this year? Is it just winning every game 5-0, going undefeated, winning a state title? Is it trying to see how far we can go in terms of season, or are we just being committed to being the absolute best that we can do, a day at a time, right? Being committed to each other and and that's where I love the 1% philosophy, right? Is, did we get at the end of each and every training session, did we get better today? Even if it was that 1%. So keeping the focus on the team internally in terms of defining our success, defining our goals first and foremost, and then from there, help turning to them and asking them, it's like, hey, what are some team goals or some team challenges that we want on a game by game basis, right? But keeping the focus on us and really trying to keep the focus on controlling the controllables, because there's so much that we don't control. There's so much that's way beyond that, and when we start diving into too much about the opponent, the other team, everything that they do, that's just less time that we spend preparing on ourselves.
I love that. Control the controllables and don't spend as much time focusing on the opposition, because that's going to take away from the time we spend on ourselves. And that can be really true, because although we've got more analysis, more data available than ever, more video, many coaches in that sense are going, right, these are the expectations, these are the non-negotiables, these are the standards, this is what success looks like for me, this is how we're going to prepare for teams. And it ends up becoming all away from the actual team to literally on the other side of the pond. And I think this is absolutely brilliant, because this could be a sellable podcast episode for any national governing body out there for CPD for coaches, because there is so much out there though, and it is true. And I love what you say there, team challenges. What are the challenges for us in a match in terms of that game? And I remember playing a friendly once, and on a whiteboard I had just some team challenges and maybe one or two for some players that I really wanted to push. And I remember the other team messaging me straight after going, oh, I really love that, I love what you're doing, I love those challenges. And I think sometimes we take away from, oh, this is success, we won 5-0, and this player scored, this player had the assist, and actually, did he have the challenge? How many interceptions did he have? How many recoveries? How many times did she have a shot on goal? And I think these team challenges are really important and something to instill and really build upon across the season, because if you were to say data track that, imagine the amount of challenges which then you've put in place over a season, and therefore that success in itself.
Right, exactly. The results kind of start to fall in place, right? They start to kind of just happen when you're not chasing them. And I think the other piece, one of the things, and I'm glad that this came up, was, excuse me, one of the things that I loved about this past Men's World Cup was you started to see the shift in certain teams, in a lot of matches, right? Is you were seeing, excuse me, you were seeing lots of goals scored at about the 30-minute mark inside of the final 15 minutes of a first half, and at that 75-minute mark inside of the final 15 minutes of the second half, right? That's where, and what you were seeing, so historically, right, lots of teams, the team that was going to concede possession, you often had, just the park the bus mentality and look for your counter, pick your spots where you can counter, possibly, right? What you started to see in this past World Cup that I loved was, and I'll explain why in a minute, but what you started to see a lot in this podcast, in this World Cup, was that you started to see teams, they started looking at the halves in phases, right? First 15 minutes, maybe we're going to kind of the usual feel, get our feet under us, feel the opponent out. Next 15 minutes, we're gonna maybe try to absorb. If we're on the defensive, we're gonna absorb, maybe relinquish a little bit more possession, and then maybe those last 10-15 minutes is really high press, go forward and take it to them, right? Rather than just trying to strictly counterattack. And you saw that a lot. You saw that in some of the successful countries that broke through in this past World Cup. And why I love that was because in many phases in the high school game, so for example, in Texas, we play 80 minutes at the high school level, so 40-minute halves, right? And how I've often looked at the game within I look at it one of two ways. I break it down into either 4 10-minute increments for each half or 2 20s, right? And we try to just break it down and simplify them, and for our players to look at it in phases, right? In terms of whether we're going to be more the aggressive, more on the attack on the front foot, or if we're going to be more on the back foot. But that's one of the things that I really feel in terms of analysis as well. That's where you're going to continue to see the game going, I think, more and more in the future.
And I think in terms of just, those phases, I think it's a good way to work and break it down for players because, if we're looking at the players' learning cycle or looking at the way they approach things psychologically, sometimes they can be overstimulated by going, I've got 90 minutes and this is the opposition and the coach has listed all these expectations for me and I'm going to play this way. And there's a lot for them to have then in terms of that expectation. Whereas sometimes if you go in for, 10 minutes, this is how this is going to look and we want you to do this. And, this 10 minutes has changed and therefore, we see that you're beating him. So now you're beating him. Can you get into the final third and hit those crosses quicker or earlier? And I think it's a great learning tool in that sense. But as a coach and being on that side of it, though, do you find that hard to manage over a course of a game consistently because of how many phases you're looking at? Or is it something which comes natural to you now?
I feel like I've always looked at it like that for a while now, but I feel like I don't always necessarily make it a point to make it a point of emphasis and focus in every single game with our team, right? I think it's sometimes the variables of the opponent, the variables of conditions, location, where we're playing. I think factoring in a number of things, and then as a coach, is like we have to be fluid, right? We don't get the opportunity to call timeout. You've really done your work in training sessions during the week, and you have pregame, halftime, and then that's it. Then you have post-match wrap-up. So everything else you have to do is kind of on the fly. And if I say to my team, hey, these first 10 minutes, maybe here is the initial thought. More than anything, just the focus and the concentration level, because you're right, is I think if we can get our athletes to focus on just increments of whether it be 10 or 15 minutes in chunks, right? In chunks rather than the whole. I think we can, in terms of whatever that focus may be, whether it's switching the point of attack, whether it's hey, our line of confrontation is going to be at midfield, or if we're trying to play wide, in through the flanks and then first service, whatever that may be, or but that can also quickly change too, right? I can't tell you the number of times. Hey, this is the focus first 10 minutes, and then boom, we quickly let in a goal in the first 2 minutes, and so you have to be able to adjust that as well. And I think as your players progress in experience levels, they get that. They understand that. And as coaches, we have to listen to our players. We have to listen. It's like, hey, here is my thought process as the coach from the sideline, right, from the touchline, but what are you seeing there? And what could we do different, right? And one of the great things that I love to challenge our players with is I'll ask them, particularly in that halftime speech, I'll ask them, and they really dive into it, right, is you're them, right? Them being the opponent. You're them. What do you do? What adjustments do you make to come against us in the start of the second half? And it really starts to open up that knowledge of theirs. So that soccer IQ piece, and I love it. We have some of the best conversations and preparation because of that.
And I think it's, that's the level of communication, that's the level of coaching, that's the level of game day management now, whereby if you break it down into periods for players, right, or 15 minutes here, 50 minutes there, because sometimes we look at players and go, all right, they're overthinking it there, or they're not playing calmly. And so all you hear then at that point is a coach shouting, calm down, calm down, calm down. That doesn't necessarily work in that sense. Whereas if you're then going with communication and going, right, for the next 15 minutes, all I'm going to do is just move up with the back line and keep it steady and just get the ball back to the keeper or pass it into midfield, for example, if you're looking at the centre back who may be overthinking it and therefore is being caught out of position quite a lot of time. So that's the level of communication which can really help settle a player, break it down for them, stop that overthinking, stop the overstimulation, and therefore allows them to approach a game. And in the back of my mind, I've got one player which I could think of it who that would work perfectly for. So, and it's not going to be the same of, right, oh, these are the instructions of the team, I'm going to shout this across for 90 minutes. But I think this is an absolute key in terms of just breaking it down into segments, especially younger players as well, because, you know, even if we reflect on their learning styles, how much are they retaining? How much information are they actually taking on board? How much have they listened beforehand, and how much then are you shouting at them? And that can be difficult from a young age.
Yeah, and what compounds it in terms of the difficulty, but what we're ultimately trying to do is encourage them, create an environment where we're empowering them to make their own decisions, right? Because the game, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've had the perfect training session on paper, all drawn out, ready to go, and then I step out onto the field for training, and it's like it's out the window, right? It's like we have to, sometimes we're struggling with something, and we're gonna. The philosophy is not do it until we get it right. It's do it until we can't get it wrong, right? So you have to pick your moments with that as well, but or they gravitate to, maybe it's something you had planned for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, 15 minutes max in a training session, and it really connects, right? It really connects, and you're just like, okay, let's stick with this, and maybe let's expand on it a little bit. So being able to have that, that fluid, that flexibility as coaches is vital. But at the end of the day is, is encouraging them, right? Whether it's the U8, the U9, the U11, or high school, encouraging them to. The biggest thing I tell them is, do not be afraid to make a decision, right? We don't want them to turn into statues out there. It's like, but make a decision. We'll talk about it later as to maybe why, what you were thinking. And then of course that gets into the soccer IQ development piece of the more we can get them to process faster, right? The slower the game becomes, which is obviously a process in itself.
And that flexibility and being fluid then, in that sense, obviously sounds like something that comes natural to you and works. And therefore, say you've got an hour session you've planned in that 25-minute technical work, but therefore it extends maybe to 45 because, some players are struggling, or the session, you've planned this perfect session on paper, but in delivery it's been completely different. Because I've been there, I've done that, and I'm like, oh, actually, I've overthought this, and this hasn't actually worked out. I remember doing that last year, and then my assistant coach was just, he looked at me and goes, what the fuck's going on? Because he was like, even he couldn't comprehend what he had to do. So he was going over to this one group, and he was trying to tell them the instructions. So I've worked with one group, I've then gone over, they're doing it completely wrong. And I was like, oh, no, it's actually this and that. He's like, mate, I don't get it. And I think that's proof in the pudding then, in that sense. So if you were to be, flexible in going, right, extending the 45 minutes, is that something that frustrates you, not being a stickler to the time and going, oh, right, this had to be done in 25 minutes? Or are you like, right, we've done 45 and therefore next week this is the same session or a session planned on this because we haven't hit the components or the outcomes in that sense?
Yeah. I think when I was younger, I used to be a stickler to it, like, hey, this is what I wrote, we're doing it this long and that's it, right? But I think it's learning is a number of factors, right? I think you have to knowing your team, where you're at. Obviously you come with a lot more patience at the start of a season, right? But if it's something we've been going over and now it's a natural progression, something that we're trying to build on, and they're looking at you like you're speaking French and they don't understand you and they don't recall, the inability to recall. And naturally, this is the moments where we choose where we start to build our vocabulary, right? Our common terminology with them. And if they suddenly can't speak to it, then I know we got to go back. We've clearly, for the sake of trying to push through and stick to the time frame of the training session, we blew right past them. It's over their head, and we got to come back to something. But I think what I've also found, though, so it's a mixed bag, because the other thing that I found too is your training sessions, like at the high school level, even if, let's say, you're afforded 2 hours, they don't have to be, they really oftentimes shouldn't be 2 hours, right? You can get so much more done keeping the focus in, hey, can we do, sometimes less is more, right? And keeping their focus and understanding the fluidity, and so much of that is preparation of your training session, right? Is being ready to go, not trying to figure it all out while they're there and they're standing around, because then that's where you lose them. But yeah, I think being fluid, knowing the timing in terms of where your team is at. It's the start of the season. Are you halfway through the season and they're just now, they've completely brain dumped something? Did they brain dump something, or did they clearly not understand something and no one really spoke up before? And then, of course, the game. The game is the natural teacher with that, right? Is because in every game, in my post-match notes, there's always at least one or two things that I say. It's like, okay, we clearly need to revisit this, right? In training sessions, this is something we need to look at. And it never fails. And some of it can be, and it doesn't mean just on the pitch in terms of training. Let's say it's a post-match, it's a recovery day the next day. That's something oftentimes, I'm a big film guy, big video guy. And the analysis and being able to speak to what we're trying to do. And, the eye, as you know, the eye in the sky doesn't lie. And the question is, it's not to ridicule a player. It's like, okay, here's what it looks like now when you look back on it. Is this what you saw yesterday in the match? Or what did you see and what were you thinking? And then we go from there. But always a learning moment for all of us, including us as coaches, right? And that's where understanding what our players are seeing or what they're thinking versus maybe what they should be seeing and what they should be thinking.
I love that. That's absolutely true, because, just because we're stood on the side, we might look at the game one way and we're like, oh, you should have passed it out to the right player, or we should have broke the line there, or we should have recovered the ball quicker. Realistically, in that sense of the mind, the player is thinking at the reaction of that moment in that time, and they maybe have that split second decision to go and do that, and therefore they haven't had that time to think about the build up in terms of how we have, because they're not looking at the full picture where we are at on the side. So the ball has come through, and therefore, all right, I've got to do this quickly and do that. And we've been right, we've seen that, we saw that coming, and therefore they haven't seen that because they're in a different position of the game and where they're at on the pitch. So, understanding the player and where they're at, what they're doing, why they've made that decision, we have to take away that criticality in that sense and go, right, there's actually a learning point here, or there's that challenge, as you mentioned earlier on. And I think, again, where, again, those, as we said on those coaching courses, it's that being a stickler for time, right? You maybe have an hour session, you've got to work this, and this, and therefore you end up becoming robotic in your coaching sense then. And because then every session looks the same, all right, this is the warm-up, this is the technical, this is the small-sided, and every week that looks the same for, 20 weeks, 30 weeks, 40 weeks. And sometimes it's just breaking out of that mold and doing something different, or coaching it differently in that sense. How do you tend to typically deliver your sessions then?
In terms of just your prototypical session?
A typical session. So, for example, is it whole, part, whole? Is it a traditional session type? Do you approach it in a different way?
Yeah, I think so. When we're in the season, leading up, preseason, it's heavier on the training, a lot more heavy on the technical piece, built-in conditioning with the ball. And then really, as you get a new group every year, it's what helps us build in terms of what is going to be, how we define our success, is starting to build that terminology, right? The common vocabulary for the team in terms of when we're on the field, but also having we tend to always have end of season exit interviews with them, end of season interviews with them, but having a preseason interview with them, if you can, as I mentioned earlier, right, in terms of, hey, what are your team goals? What are your individual goals? Digging into the why. Why do you play? This is a natural moment. Excuse me. This is a natural moment to start to learn more about your players, right? Obviously, returning players, you edit that a little bit, but that's the first piece. And so in preseason, we start to build in off of that as we approach and we're into the season. And the grind typically here is, you're going to have 2 matches during the week, right? And they're typically Tuesday and Friday. So what a week will look like usually is Monday is a prep day, and usually my standard training session is going to be somewhat, I don't know, I guess you could say somewhat traditional from the standpoint, the methodology of a very good in-depth pregame, usually a quick check-in, right? Whether it's a 2-3 minutes on what the goal of today's training session is and what we should all factor in, right? So quick 2-3 minute check-in, then your traditional, your quick pre-game or pre-training warm-up, your dynamic warm-up, then get in a technical, some sort of very quick team-oriented technical warm-up. Then you progress from there. You progress into your small-sided. Obviously, I'm very heavy in terms of the rondos and expanding on the rondos, but the small-sided, the expanded small-sided, and then also trying to get them building up the stamina in terms of soccer stamina minutes, right, through scrimmages, right. Mm-hmm. Through at the end we wrap up with scrimmaging and training, and naturally as we're progressing into the season, those minutes start to get longer. When we're in the season and if we're coming off of a heavy, maybe it's a heavy week, heavy day, every now and then we'll bypass that. But typically what that will look like is that's something what Monday would look like. Tuesday, game day. Wednesday, recovery day. Excuse me. Wednesday's a recovery day normally. And what that will consist of, that's heavy, will usually consist of a very, very heavy, deliberate, deep stretch dynamic warm-up, foam rollout, and sometimes maybe even a little bit of a yoga session, if you can. Everything we're trying to do to really break down that lactic acid. And of course, what drives that to what extent also is if we're coming off of a very tough, physical, brutal match, or maybe it wasn't that tough, that physically demanding. Just varies. And then we'll also incorporate film session, usually that same day on the tail end of that recovery piece. Thursday, right back at it, and that's where we're usually looking at our game, our post-match wrap-up notes, right, where we took our couple of things that we need to work on. And then sometimes that can be also our days where we're looking at our set piece, our set piece updates, set piece practice, everything from whether it's from free kicks to corner kicks to penalties, and then getting ready. End with a good, thorough scrimmage, getting ready and then we do it Friday all over again.
And sounds a great schedule and what's offered the players and what they're doing, and a good program to have. Certainly, different variations and how to drop in and work with players, and how, the experiences which they're going to have on a full-time basis when working with players. So when you have new players coming in and you get to learn those players, you get to understand them, who they are. Do you do a typical questionnaire? Do you sit down with them? How do you get to know who they are, or is that just something that plays out across a season for you?
Yeah, with new players, it's not so much a straight questionnaire. It's usually a handful of questions, right? In terms of pretty broad, pretty open ended, and then they start to get specific in terms of the team, in terms of their goals, in terms of why they're playing, and what's their objective? What do they want to get from the season? And it never fails. It never fails in terms of they're proud to be playing for their community, wear the crest of their school colors, have the opportunity to play with some of their great friends that they see every day, right? And grow, learn the game, grow, and they all want success as well. But then starting and then also it's with new players, it's like, hey, what the experience level you're trying to assess initially. Where if you've played a decent bit, where have you played, right, in terms of positions, right? So, do they play on the club side in addition to, because obviously they're going to be playing high school. So getting to know those very basics, I think, as coaches that we need to. But then it's also when you ask them to maybe put something down on paper, it kind of becomes self-realization for them as well, particularly with their goals. Finding their why are they doing this? Why are they playing? It's usually tends to be a really good thing for them.
And I think that's important, as you said, is that self-realization, because then becomes that self-accountability, that self-leadership.
Right.
Because sometimes they may be doing something because it's naturally been the progress route, or the family and parent have pushed them into it. But sometimes
Right.
maybe that why might not actually be, oh, I'm going to end up being a footballer. The why is, oh, to have that sporting experience to then go out and become a coach myself, or to become an analyst, or I'm going to take all these leadership skills and I'm going to be a leader elsewhere. So
Right.
sometimes they're going to find out for who they truly are, because that's one of the biggest components in life, is actually understanding who we are, where we're going, why we're doing it. And sometimes we wish we had this sort of time machine to go 10 years into the future and go, right, I know I'm going to get to this point, or I'm going to see myself getting to this point, but I have to go back here to not get to that point. And so that's where the philosophy of life comes in, and sometimes can be
Yeah.
difficult. And especially for maybe, a 15, 16, 17, 18 year old, they're still young, they haven't had those life experiences like we've had, and they're going to get to the point where we're at someday. But for them at that moment, and us being coaches and people with those experiences, trying to help them really understand who they are and those relationships and where they're going is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and and what I found is the older that I get, right? Because the student athletes, they stay the same age, right?
Hmm.
But I'm getting older.
Yeah.
So, so it's the trying to find the way to connect with them based off their interests outside of soccer, connecting with them in terms of their personalities, getting to know more about that personality as well,
Hmm.
and and through that they get to see me as well. That is like, yeah, I may be coach, I may be the authority figure, and I may be a much much older guy than them, but they start to view you in a different light, right? Not as their best friend, because we're not there to be their best friend, but they view you. It builds trust, I find, and and from my perspective, it helps build patience, because it's as a as a 45-year-old man, as a 45-year-old coach, I can't get mad at a 16-year-old young lady for not thinking like a 16 like a 45-year-old man,
Hmm.
right? The same way a 16-year-old young lady can't get mad at a 45-year-old man for not thinking like a 16-year-old young lady. So I think that those are things that through the years I've found myself having to adjust, because it's true. I didn't think about it for the longest time, but it's
Hmm.
like, hey, these student athletes, they're always the same age, but I'm not. I'm getting older, right? So you got to remember that as well.
Hmm. And obviously, as with life, we become more pessimistic. We maybe lose that motivation. We may become more disciplined, and as we end up working with those players, sometimes it's like a great teacher. You sort of have like your parents be taught by them, and then you're taught by them. You're like, really, they're not who you're describing, and that's just the natural change over time in terms of their energy, those levels, those ages, in terms of that sense. And as obviously as you're getting older now, when you look, say in 10 years, you might retire, for example, or you're in a position where you leave coaching. You look back, right, and you've got no accolades to your name, right, and on paper, Hector's got, say, a very average win record. Obviously, no trophies, nothing in that sense. But for you, knowing yourself in that sense, all right, I've developed, say, 200 players, and I've given this experience, and I've helped coaches progress, and I instilled this program, and now we're seeing players flourish because of it. Some players have gone on to achieve this in their personal lives. For you, that is a major success in terms of that sense. And when I
Right.
was listening to Vincent Company prior to coming on here, he was saying his biggest frustration in the game is that it's looked at in terms of objectives and not situational. And that would be a perfect example in that sense, because, all right, Hector didn't win this, therefore he's a bang average manager and bang average coach. But situationally, very, very different. And I think that's a very big perspective to have in terms of anyone looking at the game, and including that methodology, as you said earlier, that things are both objective and situational. And just because the objectives say different doesn't necessarily mean there hasn't been that success or outcome because the situational says different.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, and I'll give you an example to that too. Is I think sometimes as coaches we need reminders of that as well,
Mm.
because here in Texas we have, for example, we have high school soccer at the top three levels in the state in terms of sports, which is the 4A, 5A, and 6A levels. So not every high school plays, but that said, we have probably somewhere in the range of over 1,000 schools that have they have programs. They all start the year off undefeated, right?
Mm.
They all start off undefeated, but in the end, only 6 programs only 6 programs win state titles that year. They're the ones that win the last game of the season. So, and that's, two at the 4A level, that's boy, girls, 2 at the 5A level, same thing, and 2 at the 6A level. So, does that mean that the other 950 or 990 plus are not a success because they didn't win the state title? Does that mean that they didn't accomplish maybe their objective? Does that mean that they weren't truly successful that year, that season? No, because there's so much more to those stories, right? That's those teams, the coaches, they know what they've put into it that year. They know the stories, the obstacles of what they've overcome that year, and that's the power. That's the power of sport, and that's the power of our game, right? Is in terms of what it can, especially when you're a transformational coach, what it can build in these athletes for years and years and years to come. Because one day they will inevitably stop playing, right? As well, but what do they go on to do, right? Because the real objective is making them building leaders of character within our society. And that can sound, I don't know, it can sound cheesy, it can sound corny, but it's so true. It's so true. And I don't think it even hits the student athlete, right, until usually years removed from having their playing career, whether it's at the high school level, at the college level, some of them, if they're lucky enough to play at the professional level. But it hits every player at some point. And then they look back on the impact of the game, the power, the influence of coaches in them, and every player will have a story in terms of what they learned. And I think as a player, I learned a lot. Believe it or not, there's power. Sometimes there's more power from learning from coaches that that they showed you everything of how not to do things. Right? There's so much to be learned there as well. And as a player, unfortunately, I was in that situation as well, and I can tell you to this day, I learned so much from that one negative influence, right, on things not to do. And if I knew that as a 14, 15-year-old, young high school kid, that should tell you a lot.
Of course, and that's where that full circle ends up coming around in terms of that reflection process then, because as you said about those periods within a game, we also look at periods within life, and sometimes we spend so much time pre-planning or planning to get where we are, and sometimes you hear in an interview, where would you see yourself in 10 years, where would you see yourself in 15, and sometimes we're always thinking about, right, I have to go to uni, I have to do this on the program, I have to do this in my personal life, and therefore we set time goals, and therefore that time limit comes into play again in our lives, and we're too busy thinking ahead at the moment. And I remember speaking to someone on the podcast a few weeks ago, and then I literally listed all of their accolades as we naturally spoke over the conversation, and she sat there and went, "You're right, actually." And because she forgot about living within that moment, and I was like, you are forgetting about where you're currently at, what you're currently doing, and enjoying where you currently are. And sometimes breaking down, all right, I want to be this in 10 years, but do you know what? I'm actually going to focus on the next 10 days. All right, I got some training. I'm going to get, go out with my mates in 4 days' time. I'm going to have a nice meal in 7 days. And sometimes approaching it in that way is going to allow you to enjoy life. Don't plan too far ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. I've had that conversation with coaches before, younger coaches as well, when they've asked for, my recommendations and suggestions on things as it pertains particularly to coaching education, right? And one of my biggest fears, what I've noticed with the younger generation of coaches, is I stop and I tell them, it's like, hey, make sure the intended process. So, for example, we'll use the USSF model, right? The U.S. Soccer Federation model. They'll ask me, it's like, hey, I just did my D. I want to do my C by next year, first opportunity. My goal is I want to have my B in 2 years or 2.5 years and be here, right? Be coaching here. And I tell them, it's like, hey, I love the ambition. We don't want to shut that off, but the intended goal of this developmental process, it's not to see how quick you can get from badge D to badge B or to badge A or so on. But in terms of your certification, but it's more of when you've completed the D, okay, what are you going to go out and do now in terms of your development, right? Not coaching education, but just the on-the-job training of who you're coaching, right? Your clubs, how are you developing? What are you opening yourself up to besides, are you involved, on Twitter? Are you interacting with other coaches that share quite a bit of knowledge? Are you growing in between these courses, right? It's not a matter of how quick can you go from one course to the next, but learn the experiential learning, right? Of you go from the D, okay, now you get your C, you get your C when the time comes. Maybe it's after 2.5 years, and you feel like you're ready. You feel like you've developed massively. And I feel sometimes like way too many coaches put way too much of the focus on maybe the letter of the badge, the letter of the certification, versus meanwhile, so they may go from D to a B in 2.5 years, but it's very little experience in that process. And that's where the true growth and development happens, in the learning, in that experiential piece. So then they arrive to a more advanced level, but they don't maybe have the hours and the years and the interaction with multiple players and parents of the grind at maybe at a younger grassroots level. So then there's a lack of substance there. So that's why I always tell them to keep that in mind. And I get it. They want to naturally progress. I get that. We want that, but at a kind of sometimes if we want it to be a progression, not a marathon, not a race.
And again, that's where the importance of those moments for young players come in, because as much as we then have coaches who want to progress and get to their B, get to their A, and they're trying to advance quickly, whilst they're doing that, they are stepping on players because, right, I've gone to this group and now I'm suddenly at this group and I've moved on, and they're trying to, climb the ladder really quickly. And whilst doing so, these players are being stepped on because these players might have a 2-3 year program, but this coach has quickly moved on to try and get where they're at. And it's that difficult of the flip side of the coin of the progression of the coach, but then looking at the players and how they're impacted. So it's a tough one to sort of balance when you're trying to be progressive in that sense, but it's making sure if you are going to be somewhere for a short period of time, making sure you've got a good impact on the players, making sure that they remember you for the good things, and making sure that you're not taking away from their moments in terms of that.
Yeah, no doubt.
So it's a great opportunity to current director of football. Director of football looks a little bit different to coaching in terms of that sense. What does that look like for you, and what are you currently doing within that role, Hector?
So, well, it's interesting as I mentioned, and I'm glad you asked that, is what I had been doing. I am in transition. I just left that role at St. Mary's Hall, where I was as the director of football, the director of soccer there, in addition to being the varsity women's soccer coach. Really what that meant was overseeing basically all operations and leadership at St. Mary's Hall. So it was a unique entity where we had a lower school, middle school, and high school and upper school all on one campus. So we kind of were able to enact a bit of a training academy, if you will, right? Coming up from Form 1, from first grade, all the way through, that fed into the middle school, that ultimately fed into the high school, into the upper school. So we had so the vertical alignment piece was critical, right? In terms of being able to identify talent identification, talent development, and then being able to have the right coaches at all of those levels, from the lower school and the middle school level. So this way, these players were that much more ready when they arrived in the upper school, right, and ready to play, hopefully at the varsity level. And we also couldn't do it without, and we did have to have a small army of volunteers at the lower school level to help accommodate us with that. But we found it was a natural fit, because it also helped our community of parents understand what we were trying to do, right? So the buy-in level was there, and so that's a big part of it. And then, of course, the part that every coach loves, the administrative piece of paperwork, schedules, coordinating all kinds of different scenarios, travel, budgetary stuff, all of that, and in addition to, and then all the moving parts, but overseeing as well the critical development of our coaches.
And when it comes down to coaching then, and say that administration level of director of football, do you prefer being at that operational level, or do you prefer being down on the grass and coaching?
Every coach is always going to prefer just down on the grass coaching, right? No doubt. But what I found is, that if you don't have a soccer guy, a football guy, right, in that operational, in that operational role, you're going to have a non-football, non-soccer guy making those decisions. And then that's where coaches kind of get, those same coaches that are out on the pitch, out on the grass, they start asking themselves, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this way? This doesn't make sense, right? So I felt like, that I can't really complain too much, because if not, those decisions will still be made, and we rather, as it relates to our soccer programs, we prefer that they're made by a soccer person, right? Or at least have somebody in that capacity, in that role, helping speak up for what we're trying to do. And so I learned real quick to not complain about that one, I guess. But like I said, that's what I was doing at St. Mary's Hall, but I am no longer there. I left at the end of last month, at the end of May, and then I'm getting ready for a new role, new job.
And for the very exciting moment which we've been building up for, and something which we've been preparing for. What is this exciting new role which you're moving into, Hector?
So I'm proud to say, happy to say, excited. I will be moving on to, I will be the new head varsity women's soccer coach at MacArthur High School here in San Antonio. And so big difference in terms of the private school side versus the public school side. So MacArthur High School ironically, isn't very far from St. Mary's Hall at all. It's about 5 minutes down the road. But it's a program with a very rich history in women's soccer. And they've kind of had fallen through some hard times as everyone around them was getting bigger, and they were not growing. They weren't getting bigger, but due to a recent realignment, they're now really at the right classification level where they should be. And I'm excited. There's definitely some talent there. Lots of players there that are eager to succeed, to want success. It's a very it's a very ambitious administration, and I'm grateful to Mr. Hernandez, the principal there, and as well as Coach Kevin Hurst, the athletic coordinator there, who were willing to give me that opportunity, take a chance on me. But they're very ambitious. They're very excited. They know the level of talent that's there, and they just felt like if they could just get the right coach in place, that they could lead them to some future success. So I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it, and we'll see what transpires.
Well, it sounds very exciting, and a great appointment for them in terms of that sense. And I think that there is going to be success, and they're very lucky to have a coach like yourself, because having never met you before but only seen you on socials, and just spending this time with you, it's been very deep and meaningful, and there's so much within this. And I know this is probably for me in the top 1% of episodes, but it's great because it's got me thinking, it's got me reflecting, it's got me going to levels where I'm like, I enjoy talking about this, and it's great to hear about Hector and talking about player development and talking about how he approaches things and how does this relate to life. And although sometimes people may think we're having one-to-one conversation, in my head I'm going boom, 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 right. and but it's so exciting for you to have that and where you're going, and it's great to have a growing program as well, and having someone on, a group on board where they're like, oh, this is the direction, this is the vision, how do you want to fit this in, how this is interlinked. So it's very exciting from the outside here how that's going to play out and look for you as well as them.
Well, I appreciate that. That's appreciate the kind words. You're flattering me there a little too much there, Coach. But no, I appreciate that. It's been great to be on here with you, and I get it. You don't have to explain it to me at all in terms of whenever you're interviewing somebody on a podcast, being a fellow podcaster, just like yourself, I view it as like I have the best seat in the house when I get to sit down and talk with coaches or student athletes, college coaches, high school coaches, because I'm always learning something, right? That's the beauty of you have a particular question for a guest, and they're always, sometimes you're gonna hear the same things, some of the same coach speak, but then you'll ask a particular question, and maybe you've asked it before, but it's a different spin, right? It's like that's an angle that I had never thought about, right? Or you're asking a similar question, but it's like, hey, I don't know what Luca's situation is, right? So I need to ask this question because maybe his experience is going to be totally different from some of these other coaches. So yeah, I view it as being able to have the best seat in the house, and always learning something, And yeah, I think it's been great, and being able to be on here with you, I think, has been awesome. And no doubt, I think I'm learning just as much from you. Trust me, in every single conversation, just like, with that's the best part. And it shouldn't take coaching courses. It shouldn't take certification courses. That's one of the awesome things about soccer Twitter, right? About Twitter, football on Twitter. There is being able the soccer community, the football community is great. It's very good. It has its knuckleheads, it has its toxic people. Unlike just like everywhere else, you're not escaping those. But I think, it lends itself to an opportunity like this, right, where I'm getting to interact with you. You're on the other side of the world, and I'm getting to interact with you here. And you were gracious enough to ask me on your podcast, and and I'm taking notes here too. I'm walking away with a lot of great nuggets here as well. So I'm grateful.
And likewise to you, I'm absolutely very lucky to have you on and have you had said yes. And it is great to connect and have that across the other side of the world. And it's exciting to see where you're going to be, in 6 months' time, or what you're doing, or how the role's working out, and what you're doing in that sense. And yeah, as you said, it's the best seat in the house, and it's really enjoyable to speak to yourself and learn. And I don't know whether you noticed me making notes as we've been chatting, but I'm like, I want to quickly grab that, and this minute he said this and that, but that's how great it's been. And for me, that's where the actual learning comes from, and it's been so great.
Right. I appreciate. Yeah, I got my own notes here too. I don't know if you can see them, but yeah, I got some as well. And yeah, no, it's been awesome. And I think, and any opportunity, as I mentioned to you earlier before we started, any opportunity as a fellow podcast, just like with mine, when podcasters, it's not a competition thing. Anytime we can come on and support one another. And like I said, I know you're still in the early stages of what you're doing. So am I. So am I. Right. So is the 50/50 podcast. But I like what you're doing. You're putting together, you've already put together a very, diverse, broad, and very, very special group of coaches and guests on here, and still playing catch up on listening to the Reflective Coach podcast. But I really dig what you're doing. I think it's really awesome.
Well, I really appreciate that, Hector, and the kind words really mean a lot. I know we spoke about going for an extended period of time, and we have done so far. And I don't want to keep you too much longer on your Saturday. But if I could throw some quick fire questions at you before you go, and allow you to enjoy the rest of your day, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, fab. So, if you have to have someone describe Hector in 3 words, what 3 words would they be?
Someone describe me? I don't know. An interesting character. I don't know. We'll say that one.
Yeah, no, that's good. I know you're moving into a new role now. You've had some great experiences, but if you had free reign to choose any country in the world to coach, where would it be?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say it's probably a toss-up. It's probably 50-50, no pun intended, right? Probably 50-50 between, I'd say, maybe Spain and England, maybe the US, or somewhere in the UK.
Very nice, very nice. The weather might not be as nice as America, or the horizons aren't as wide, but it's an experience which you could have. It's one of those where I speak to American coaches and I'm like, I'd love to go to America, and they're going, I'd love to come to England.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, yeah, because just the history, the history, the tradition, and just the opportunity, right? So no doubt. I think just I feel like I could go there and learn an abundance in terms of coaching, education, without even stepping on a field. It's that rich there. And when you start, especially when you start talking about Western Europe.
Of course, I think it'd be interesting. Who knows where that might play out for you, and whether that's something which might be in your long-term thinking. If you could spend a day with any coach or manager, who would it be?
Ooh. I would say, I don't know. Ooh, that's like it's kind of, I would say maybe, for the obvious reasons of maybe Klopp, because just I really dig him. I feel like Pep is the too obvious, right? Just the too obvious. But I would say Jurgen Klopp, only because, besides the obvious of being a Liverpool guy, I like his style, and I like his sense of humor, and I just like him as a person, as a character. and I just feel like there's so much in terms of how he is. I think that's part of the connection he builds with his players, right? But then I would say also, so that's like maybe one, and 1A would maybe be uh, Jose Mourinho, right? Just because I feel like that guy. Sometimes I've told some of my friends, it's like I wish I didn't love this guy, because he's such a character. But I cannot. I have to admit that I love him just because he's so, he's the special one, as they say, right? So every now and then, just little things that he does just mesmerize me, right? So in terms of living, I would say though maybe those two. Not living, I would probably have to maybe go. It's got to be Cruyff. I would say, yeah, Johan Cruyff, without a doubt, just because I relate to so much in terms of not the tiki taka piece as it's what it evolved into, but the true total football, right? Big fan of that.
Some absolute great choices there, and I'm glad you've mentioned Mourinho. But I think Klopp would definitely be one, because if you look at what he'd done at Mainz to then Dortmund, to identifying players on cheap and taking them to being with multi-million-pound players, to challenging Bayern, to then going to Liverpool and getting them up to those levels to compete with City, and breaking that duct of how long they haven't won a title. I think that's a route of a man who's come right through the stages, and sort of very similar to Thomas Tuchel in terms of that sense as well.
There you go. Yeah, and as you know, that's a very different bio than Pep, right? That's a very different bio than Pep in terms of how Pep came up. So yeah, so exactly, that's really a big reason why. Like I said, it's obvious to say because I'm a Liverpool guy, but it's so much more than that. But yeah, you're right. You're dead and spot on.
Top answers. If you could manage any footballer, who would it be?
If I could manage any footballer, ooh. I'm trying to come up beyond the obvious, right? Beyond there, because it's so easy to say Messi or Ronaldo, Cristiano. Never really thought about that one. That's an interesting one. I would like to say also because I'm a Real guy, I'm a Real Madrid guy, so I'm very mesmerized by a big fan of Luca Modric. So I'd say maybe someone like him, or maybe even like the very humble, just phenomenal footballer in N'Golo Kante. Those crafty midfielders, right? That just they do so much. It doesn't show up in terms of on the stat line, but they do so much for their teams, right? I would say maybe something like that. I think if I could maybe coach just off the top of my head on the men's side. On the women's side, I would say legendary player. She was way ahead of her time, and a lot of people don't really know about her because she's arguably considered the most top to bottom, the most all around, most skilled player to ever play for the U.S. women's national team, and that would be Michelle Akers. I don't know if you ever heard of her, but yeah, Michelle Akers. Maybe I would love to, just because she was from fitness and mentality and size and technical skill level and tactical skill level. She was one of the very first pioneers. She before Mia Hamm, So I would say I would have loved to have been able to coach a player like that.
Again, top choices, and I think N'Golo Kante, a very hidden gem, very level-headed, very focused. I reckon an easy to manage player, and they're very few to find. Someone who's happy, whether he's not getting a minute, someone who comes off the bench, someone who starts, someone who does his part for his team, and you never see him really moaning in the press or media. You never see him, out doing mistakes or doing stupid things. And I just, he's an absolutely underrated player, especially as a Chelsea fan myself. I just feel like a kick in the teeth if he leaves, because we never really took him to the levels he should have been.
Yeah, he's one I find that as a coach I would be learning from him regularly. Even him in his role as a player, I feel like I would still be learning from him. So yeah, great stuff.
Who was or is your role model?
It's funny because I'm fans of different people in different industries, if you will, big fans. But in terms of really role model or hero, if you will, I've only really ever had one, and that's my dad. My dad. To this day, when I think in terms of actual true role model hero, massive influence on my life in terms of to this day. And it drives me nuts because the older I get, the more I find myself saying a lot of the exact same things he said, right? And you'll get there one day, you'll see that, you'll experience that. But yeah, I would say the true role model, the ultimate role model, my hero is my dad.
I love a personal choice and someone close to home and someone who has that impact and influence. Don't worry, I'm already starting to see those little things while I'm in school and the things I say and the way I sit and do things. I can already see it, and yeah.
Yeah, you'll scratch your head. You'll be like, I can't believe I just said that.
I know. If say you had the choice of any job in the world, whether it be the Real Madrid job, the Liverpool job, the US national team job, the women's job, England women's, any job out there, which one would it be?
Ooh, I'm gonna play fantasy on this, and I'm gonna say, so in one of the questions that I ask regularly, so in my podcast, I have a segment, something similar to like this, what you're doing right now. We call it's our counterattack segment, right? So it's kind of rapid fire, and one of the questions that I ask is, if you were soccer czar in America, right? You're in charge of all of soccer, right? What would I always ask? What would be maybe the very first decision you make day one? Anything goes. So I would say I'm going to make one up, and I would say that's what I would love to do, is to be able to oversee all of soccer in America. And number of factors, obviously, that I would. But yeah, I think pay to play is a big one. You have to try to find a way through sponsorships, find a way to kind of make the game more equally accessible to more people, particularly in America, because it continues to be more of a divider and more of a separator if you're not, because it costs a lot of money, and that's the unfortunate part.
And that's a topic that I've actually discussed with quite a few American coaches, because everyone that I've spoken to from the US is saying how diverse football may be here, how different it may be in that one point, and how much untapped talent there may be. But it's how exciting that the US national team is trying to go in that right direction while it's building. But you say, the geography across, the US, the population, how many footballers there currently are to what they can be. Compare that to England in that sense. Realistically, the USA should be in the top three national teams out there because of the amount of talent that they'd have to choose from. So I think that'd definitely be exciting, because that pay to play and changing that and how players come through and maybe the grassroots program and how that looks nationally, I think is quite an exciting prospect to sort of think of from the outside of the pond in terms of that sense. But I think that would be a great role.
Yeah, and it's interesting, we're at a pivotal stage, right? We're at a pivotal stage. Here we are, it's going to be 32 years later from the first time we hosted the World Cup. We're about to host it for the second time in 2026, United 2026, along with Canada and Mexico. And it's a pivotal time in terms of the sport in this country, right? And the future of it. And, two of the big ones are player development and the role of pay for play and the impact and how it weeds kids out before they ever have an opportunity. And the other one being just the whole, and this is a whole other can of worms, but the lack of promotion, the zero, just absence of promotion and relegation in this country, and which is also the dangerous part of what they're trying to do and what they're trying to maybe, it's going to come back again, talks of the Super League, right, in Europe, with UEFA. So yeah, I mean, it's just, I think that is a dangerous piece in terms of trying to keep the sport as part of the people, part of the communities, right? You see the awesome story there in terms of promotion to the Premier League with Luton Town, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, those are just fascinating stories, and we don't have those here. We're missing out on those opportunities. So yeah, I think, and that's kind of why I said soccer czar, because for reasons like that, some big picture stuff, the 35,000 feet, decisions, 35,000 foot view, and also one example, and people have different thoughts, but I know it's a very controversial decision. A lot of people are heated about the recent, U.S. In the Nations League, CONCACAF Nations League, U.S. just beat Mexico in the semifinal. And in the middle of that, what kind of stole the show is that Greg Berhalter is returning as manager. And it just left a lot of people perplexed and scratching their head and wondering, why is it him again? So decisions like that, and how maybe the U.S. Soccer Federation could be far more inclusive and less exclusive, and far more transparent. things like that is kind of why I say the soccer, the soccer czar, I think would be great.
I think so too, because recently the US appointed an interim manager of the assistant manager who's like an analyst or something, haven't they?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I just and that and yet here the U.S. is they looked probably their best the other night with the interim to B.J. Callahan, who was the interim to the interim, right? So yeah, and then it's just it's I don't know. It's just it's frustrating on a lot of levels, I guess.
So whilst you've had the experience of being in the military and doing that side of things and working out in coaching now, say the coaching side didn't work out, what would you be doing now?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm very as I continue to evolve and grow in this role is as a podcaster is I'm very passionate about just this piece as the independent media, right? In terms of the coverage of, because as you know, and with my podcast, with the 50/50 podcast, we cover Texas high school soccer, college soccer, and the club game to a certain extent. It's just so much harder to get your arms around the club game for a number of reasons, but the independent media piece covering getting outside of big media, traditional media, and growing, I think the network of podcasters and podcasters such as yourself who are they're doing this for the right reasons. It's great. It's great people, great intent, trying to grow the game, give back to the game, and spread knowledge, right, and collaborate. I find myself very passionate about that. So I don't know. I think as we continue to grow our team, trying to see what it can evolve to as independent media and be able to cover the sport more in America, and I don't know, and maybe that's also via an eventual larger network with multiple shows, multiple podcasts from different angles, but shows and podcasts that are maybe giving back to the game in some capacity and that are entertaining and fun and great guests, high character leaders as guests who are doing it for the right reasons. I don't know, maybe something like that, I guess, off the top of my head. But as I find myself going through this process more and our podcast team grows, it's something that I'm definitely becoming more beyond intrigued, I guess you could say more passionate about.
Sounds very interesting, and who knows where that could lead to and end up going. Could end up having your own private media company.
Could you imagine that?
Just from starting a podcast.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't know if I want to get that far ahead of myself, but yeah, I think it's one of those things in terms of where, because you can clearly see, right? You can see what's happening with the traditional media, right, as it relates to just the different platforms, the different you see it with news organizations, and sports coverage is no different, right? Sports coverage, and this is kind of what you're doing here, and what we're doing here this is kind of the future of media, the future of the game, and where it's headed.
Absolutely. What is your biggest pet peeve?
Ooh, biggest pet peeve? Just in general, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess it kind of probably comes back to the golden rule, right? Is treating others. It's kind of 1 and 1A. Treating others as you wish to be treated, but I think also in terms of character, right? You can't really escape that word with me. I always come back to that, but seeing how people treat others, seeing how one person treats another that can do nothing for them. You know what I mean? So from that perspective, just because I think that's where you see the true colors, the true colors of a person, the true intent of a person. Because if they don't stand to gain from interacting with a certain person, do they still treat them with a certain level of respect? And I get it. It's different when you know somebody, but yeah, I would say probably maybe that.
I love that. Such a good answer to that one. What is your favorite thing to do in your actual downtime away from podcasting, coaching, and the world of sport?
Just being with the family, right? Watching movies. I've learned. I'm learning, I guess you could say, now that as I've retired from the military, and like right now, right as I'm into transition, waiting to start my new role, I'm learning how to be okay with decompressing and probably maybe doing nothing at times, right? And just being with the family, watching movies, and just for me, it feels sometimes like nothing, but it feels like it's a very important something, right? And but outside of that, reading, heavy reader, and working on a lot of just digital graphics. I'm a big digital graphic guy, and then being outside and trying, hopefully this summer, getting to do some sort of camping and maybe do some fishing, and then I'm a big shooter as well. So hitting the firing range, being able to go out to the firing range regularly, stuff outside, I would say.
Definitely sounds interesting things, and hopefully someone works out. But going to the firing range is like one of my all-time things on my to-do list. I had a good friend years ago, and he say him and his mates, they would hire out a house outside of Texas or Las Vegas, and they would do a firing range. They would go in casinos. They'd come back, and it was just sounded like the most amazing thing. And ever since he said that, the firing range is definitely on my top 10 things to do.
Well, we got to get you to any future trips coming to the U.S. Or?
Well, my best mate, he lives out in California, so my degree finishes in 2 years, and he's like, come out to Cali, and so every American coach which I've spoken to, they're like, yeah, if you want to link up in America or do this in America or recommend there, it's given me the more excitement to literally, as soon as the degree is done, boom, America, off I go.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that would be great. And and with what you're doing here too, in terms of like the Reflective Coach podcast, if you're I don't know if you're familiar with the organization, the United Soccer Coaches. Are you familiar with them? Yeah. They have their. I know they're shifting from what they used to call Podcast Row to Media Row, but if there's ever the opportunity for you to do that, I would definitely recommend that, because there's a great number of podcasts that come in. And they have a slew of guests, right, that are there, because that's the biggest coaching convention, I think, in North and South America, I think, when they have it. I know next year in January it'll be in Anaheim, California. But I think doing stuff like I unfortunately can't do it because it's always when we're in right smack dab in the middle of our season. So I continue to not be able to go, but that's something that's on my bucket list at some point, because I want to go at some point.
That coaching convention just looks absolutely amazing, and what you have in America, it's just unreal in that sense. But hopefully, if I do get out to America, then I can meet you in person and see what you're doing, because that would be incredible.
Yeah, you got a spot. Hey, you got a place here in Texas. Just let me know. We definitely would love to have you come out here as well, and it would be awesome. It would be great.
Yeah, I love and appreciate that, and Texas is definitely, a state that I'd love to go to, because I think that's just, every different state in America is just so fascinating.
Yeah, Texas is, in more ways than one, it can feel like its own country, but you have to experience it to see, you have to see it and experience it to get it. So, but it's not something that people are making up when they say that.
Absolutely. And one final question for you then: what is the one thing you enjoy most about coaching, Hector?
I think the process that leads to the connection, right? That lifelong connection piece, either with your athletes years later when you hear from them, right? And they're doing different things in their careers, and also just I love it when you see a player, their years removed, their career, maybe their playing career is over, and they're still heavily involved in the game. They've fallen in love with the game, and they're huge supporters of the game. Or in some cases now I'm starting to kind of have a small little coaching tree from former players that have now transitioned and are becoming coaches. So that's always awesome to see. So I think that in itself, and then just like I said, just being able to say that I'm trying to do everything I can to play my little small part in trying to give back to the game.
Sounds absolutely great in terms of that, and I think that finishes off what is such a wonderful episode. And I know I really appreciate time, and it's creeping up on 2 hours now. And if you've got the missus or wife, they're probably texting you when you finish, and that kind of thing. But I really do appreciate that we have got this organised, and as said many times already, it's been great to have you on, and I really appreciate it. And best of luck in the new role, and I hope to see great things. And again, the time is really appreciated, Hector. So a big thank you from me.
Likewise. Thank you so much again for having me. I appreciate it. Keep doing what you're doing, beyond the likes and the retweets and the follows and the downloads. Just keep doing what you're doing, because it got my attention, and I really like what you're doing. I love what you're doing, what you're about. And thank you for having me. And sorry that we went as long as we did. I didn't mean to come up for it to turn into like the Joe Rogan level length of podcast. But I really appreciate you. Had a great time. Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely, and it's really not a problem having those 2 hours. So I was just conscious in the back of my mind how long we were going for, and every time I pick out a JRE podcast episode, I'm like, really, 3.5 hours?
No, you gotta have stamina.
Yeah,
you gotta have stamina. So great stuff. Thank you again, Luca.
No worries. Thank you, and enjoy your weekend, and take care, and definitely keep in touch. But thank you, Hector.
Likewise. Thank you.
Bye.